Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced at North Idaho College on the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guest.
We're so pleased to continue our very special series titled Celebrating Canadian-American Friendship. On today's program, our subtopic is Understanding Life in Canada and the United States. We have such a wonderful guest, and we're delighted to welcome her, a native of Canada, Elizabeth Smythe Brinton. She is an author and a lecturer, and she was one of the keynote speakers during our week's symposium on this topic at North Idaho College back in March. She was born in Toronto, Canada, and was the youngest daughter in a family of four. Her family owned the Toronto Maple Leaf hockey team, and I'm happy to report that during that decade of ownership, they won the Stanley Cup 4 times. What a great cup that is. And she, as I've indicated, is an author, and her book that's coming out soon is titled My American Eden. Elizabeth, you've been so generous to be with us during our week of our symposium and to be on this program, and we thank you for helping us understand more about our great friends to the north, Canada.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's just such a delight, and I'm so thrilled and proud of the school, this college, to have this symposium. I think it's so important, and it all begins right here.
Thank you so very much, and as always, I'm pleased to have our regular panelist, Janelle Burke, who's an attorney in the state of Idaho, and she will commence the questioning with our distinguished guest today.
Elizabeth, it's a pleasure to have you here. When you addressed the students at North Idaho College, you talked about two brothers. Who are the two brothers, and what is the significance of, what is the theory or the significance behind that description?
Well, the topic Two Brothers really expresses, in my view, the relationship between our two nations, and it has to do with the way I was raised. I told a story of my experience with Canadian-American relations beginning right on the border, literally at the Peace Bridge. We were driving to Buffalo, New York on a shopping expedition, thinking everything we were going to buy would be better in the States. And we'd get out at the line of flags and stand right on the border. And I was about 7 years old at the time. And we got there, and some other kids were doing the same thing, and they said Canadian or American. And we said Canadian. And the answer was too bad. And we said too bad. And the answer came, yes, I feel very sorry for you. And we said, why? And this young man, who was becoming a saucy boy in my opinion, said, well, we're the greatest country in the world, and you're not even good at anything. And, you're missing everything. And so I was just sort of dumbfounded. And my sister, who can always be counted on in these kinds of situations, said, we're good at being Canadians. And then we sort of walked off in a huff. And we got home and we told this tale to my father, who thought her answer was very funny. And then I asked, well, what should we have said? And he said, we're children of a common mother. And we fought side by side in 2 world wars. We have to stick together. That's the way it is.
Thank you. That was a beautiful answer to my question.
Isn't that just a great answer? As someone who has lived in Canada, was born in Canada, you've also lived in the United States, or do now, would you share with our viewers some of the, I want to do this in a series of questions, and first of all, on my visits to Canada, I just love it. I think that we are great friends, and share with us some of your favorite characteristics of Canada and life in Canada. There's such a long list, but if you just share some of those, what you're most proud of concerning the history and the life of the people of Canada.
Well, first of all, the nation itself physically is profoundly beautiful. And thanks to just having seen a film that gave an overview of the whole country, I was once again reminded of how gorgeous it is from coast to coast, and how beautiful still the woods and the wilderness are. And that wilderness is vast, it's immense, it's boundless still. When I was growing up, I went on long canoe trips, 36 days at a time, where we traveled 1,000 miles, canoe and portage. Didn't see any civilization. And when you go out like that from everything, you're given a wonderful sense of feeling safe and all right, and that you have everything you need, and it's tremendous freedom. So when I think of the history of Canada and the people that settled there, the challenges, obviously our environment is more challenging because of the winters and how we've had to adapt, but we've made all of our children aware of how beautiful the lakes and woods are and how they're right at our doorstep.
One fortunate thing about our celebrating one another in this week is that we're both huge countries, and geographically speaking, and we both have beautiful landscapes. And let's talk a little bit more about Canada's activities. In fact, one of my friends who's visited the entire world, in all parts of the world, he says the most beautiful mountains he has ever seen is in the Banff area, even greater than the Alps, and he thinks. So in addition to this geographical beauty, what are some of the great things? Is skiing, hockey, and you have great, great democracy and a political system. So just share in some detail some of those really great things in different aspects of your life.
Well, there's the sense that law and order always came first, safety first. Be prepared for anything. And remember when we were coming into the millennium and everybody was in the Y2K and so on and so forth. And I remember hearing from Canada that the army was set, they had blankets, they had food, they had water. And so I'm always prepared if I have to just get home quickly. And I know that in any emergency, whether it's a power outage or a deep freeze or anytime people are in trouble, we, because of our cold winters, have had to adapt to being ready and being safe and always helping one another. I can remember a really bad cold spell where the power went out, and I called my mother immediately. How was everything? And she said, oh, the Army's here, and Fran Deacon's luncheon went off as planned, and 3 women arrived in a tank. And that's what I love, that you could go to the street corner and say, excuse me, young man, I have a luncheon. Would you be so kind as to drive me there? And so that is the kind of thing that I tell my children. And when my son became a Canadian citizen and he went out to British Columbia to be a liftie in Roslyn, I said, how do you spell Canada? C-A, prepared, A. D-A, prepared, A, and so on. So that's, I think, our motto, be prepared.
Now, also, you've lived in this country for a period of time, and what are some of your favorite things about the United States?
The American people are incredibly generous and good-hearted and more willing to help and pitch in and you bet and be there when there's trouble than any people I know. I think that the American people are so friendly and so welcoming. It's been a privilege for me to be here all along. Plus, I'm a passionate devotee of politics and culture, and it's always exciting. You just don't know what's going to happen. When I first learned the primary system, for instance, it seemed so complex at the beginning, but then I thought, how fun. And I went to the Democratic Convention in San Francisco when Geraldine Ferraro was nominated as the first female presidential candidate. And that was just marvelous to be there. So I get very swept up in the Times and the Oscars and the whole bit. And I think a lot of Canadians do. And, you know, we have been there in great numbers as performers and filmmakers because that is the drama of this experience of immigrants in a new world, that where we've gotten to and where we're going.
Thank you very much. Janelle Burke.
Sports are a big thing in Canada and in the United States as well, but there probably are some differences as to what's popular in one place or another because of the climates that you have to work with. So your family was very involved with hockey.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about the sports that are popular in Canada and the sports that are popular in the U.S. and make some comparisons?
Oh, what an interesting question. Thank you for the opportunity. It does have a lot to do with environment. We did have a backyard skating rink, and when we moved here to Coeur d'Alene from California, I thought the first thing we could do was create a rink in our yard, and unfortunately I didn't have any tips from my father to draw on, so we had some very interesting experiments that caused floods and damage because it doesn't stay cold enough. So that's really the whole essence of hockey in Russia and Canada, is that you can make a rink and it will last right in your driveway or your backyard, and that's what the kids play on. But in terms of organized sports, of course, we all love baseball as well. I think it's great to get the kids out playing. Soccer is marvelous. It doesn't cost a lot. You can get any league going. My son played right here on the college and in McEwen Field in our neighborhood. Lacrosse is an ancient, marvelous game that he played in high school that I think was probably the precursor to hockey, because it's just kind of airborne hockey with less equipment and padding. So I think it's all very wonderful, and the fact that we compete together is great. And in terms of Winter Olympics, when you think of Canada being 1/10 the population of the United States, we always make a pretty fair showing. And we love sports, and we love to compete, and we love to welcome competitors to our cities, and we'll have a game.
You may have a much smaller population, but you sure taught us how to play a hockey properly. It was years before we could win in hockey with the professional teams from Canada, and of course in baseball too we have this wonderful competition. I want to, time always goes so fast on the program, but I want you to talk a little bit about your book coming out, My American Eden, and I'm going to ask them to put up on the screen your website too, which that people can get in touch with you, but I believe it's www.elizabethbrenton.com.
Yes.
But tell us a little about your upcoming book, My American Eden, and the thesis of that book.
It's based on a true story about a woman who gave her life for the cause of freedom in Boston in 1660. They passed laws banishing Quakers, could not stop them from coming. They came one by one, had tongues bored, ears cut off, whippings, fines, until they upped the ante to pain of death. And so 4 Quakers gave their life for this cause. I was just walking down the street one day, browsing through a history book, and I read about this woman. And what intrigued me was that she did it twice. The first time she had the noose around her neck, her face bound, the people on either side of her were dropped, and she was given a last-minute reprieve by the governor and released into the custody of her husband, which she did not accept, but they sent her off. And then a year later, she went back. So to me, that was the most phenomenal courage that I could think of, and I was fascinated by her. So I started just doing a bit of research, and a few months into it, I learned that the statue commemorating this woman that sits in front of the Massachusetts State House, my husband's grandmother was the model for the statue. So it's her likeness that sits there. And then I thought, well, this is meant to be, and I must pursue this goal. It's been 10 years in the making, and I'm very thrilled to be able to bring her to life.
Now, for those who want to get the book when it comes out, they could come to your website, or they could go to a bookstore.
Amazon, Barnes & Noble, bookstores. It's
Wonderful.
Available to order now.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
By the time this program airs, it'll be June, but it'll certainly...
It'll be out there. It'll be out the end of April.
Yes. One other point on that before we go back to Janelle, and that is that for 7 years on the Popcorn Forum and Convocation series here, we have done in the past Chautauqua performances, and one thing that's so delightful about what you've done and what happened on that, there's a number of extraordinary women and men in history who've been kind of lost in history. They're not well known as some others, and so this gives an opportunity to recognize them. And so we'll have to have you to come back to North Idaho College and address our audience in honor of this brave lady.
I would love that, because after she was executed, there had been civil war in England at the time, and it was under Cromwell's era. But the tide turned, and King Charles II was restored to the throne. Quakers in England got word to him. The first thing he did was pass a decree banning religious persecution. They sent a ship to Boston right away, and the law was changed. So it wasn't just a sad tale of someone who went down. It was really the beginning of the separation of church and state. And because we had founding fathers with Quaker backgrounds, they would have known well the sufferings of this period. And it's such an important part, it's such an important piece of the American pie, if you will, that I think it's great that we honor that and we carry on that separation.
Thank you very much. Janelle.
When you have two brothers, and that's the title of the address that you gave to the students at North Idaho College as part of the symposium, when you have two brothers often go to visit one another, so they go back and forth. And certainly in our case, in the United States and Canada's case, we have many Canadian visitors who come to the U.S., and of course U.S. visitors go to Canada. Can you tell us something about traveling between the two countries?
Well, our border, for instance, is the longest undefended border in the world, something I'm very proud of, and you should be too, because just imagine if we didn't get along. Just imagine if we had to try to close that border through all the woods and rivers and lakes, and it would be so difficult. So we try to make travel as friendly and easy as possible, and we have lots of tournaments and little exchanges back and forth all along the border towns. They're very friendly on either side. Some people go back and forth every day, and there's every once in a while there'll be a CBC episode in Canada about people that commute back and forth. We always, as I said, went to shop. Now the reverse has happened with the Canadian dollar being a bit lower. Lots of Americans are going up to shop to get great meals, get a good deal on a restaurant, make a film, produce the film. So it's great economically, and our two economies are just absolutely joined at the hip.
Thank you.
When I was there last year, purchased $100 of goods, and it was $65, and you really love spending under those circumstances, like going to a sale with 35% off.
Right.
It was just wonderful, and the people were so friendly. In relation to, again, what we're celebrating this week, there's a difference in our systems too, both of them democracies, but would you spend a little time talking about how the parliamentary system is different from our presidential election system in our Congress, where under your system you have the legislative and executive always in the same party. Mm-hmm. If you win the House, you've got the Prime Minister. Mm-hmm. And I'm not here to ask you if you prefer one over the other one, but there is some differences there that oftentimes
Yes.
Americans don't understand.
Yes, although we still are, as I said, children of the same mother.
Right.
So our evolutionary process comes from the same root, which was a long time in the making. By the time the first settlers came to New England, democracy had been in place in one form or another in England for 300 years. So they had, during the Civil War, a goal of one true parliament, true representation. And I think the difference is in how it's viewed by the public. For instance, I'll give you an example of my grandmother, who read the paper every day, the whole editorial page every day. I do not know how she voted. I do not know any party affiliate. I don't know whether she was liberal or conservative, although every moral ethic and understanding I have came from her about how to behave and what was good and so on. I don't know if she had a true leaning. I do know that they always felt it was their duty to meet everyone running in their riding, which is your district, and you're sending the man from your district. So they would always go out to the tees and meet the candidate and discuss him as a man and or what he wanted to do, or eventually her as a woman. And they'd make a choice based on an idea of who they wanted to be there representing them. So I felt it was a little more personal and a little less partisan. And then new parties came along, so we encompassed more parties. So there's a bit more choice. And sometimes if you go for the minority, you might be able to get some deals going and so on. So there's a little bit more shifting around there.
More coalition at times,
Yes.
if particularly one party doesn't win a majority.
Yes,
in-
yes. Then
in
they
the
might
parliament.
be in league with another
minor
minority
party.
and they might make some deals together. Well, as in the United States, it feels very either or, and I feel like I can almost tell in the first 10 minutes of a conversation where someone's going to pretty much fall along party lines. So.
Yeah. Except we have that big independent
Right,
block,
right,
but
right.
they still in the end go to one part or the other.
Right.
We've always been a real two-party system, very much two-party. Something else that I find fascinating about the country of Canada, and that has to do with the two languages, the English and the French. In Quebec, one of our other speakers, Dr. Olskamp, talked about that even a law in Quebec that the official language is French. But as you go in the western part of Canada, where I've been, you have all these signs with both English and French. And personally, I find that very appreciative. We've been a little more resistant in learning more than one language, although now with the great growth of the Hispanic Latino community in our country, Spanish is becoming much more important and taught. So now you'd like to compare this, the language issue in your country, or the French and English influences in your country?
Well, the Official Languages Act really came as a big surprise, and it took us all by storm. And in my talk, I said, "Oh, how they roared when it was pronounced that we would have to print all the labels on a Campbell's soup can in French and English, and the street signs would have to change." And of course, people at West were, "What are you talking about? I don't even speak French." Well, I can't do that. And so there was resistance, absolutely. But when it came down to that whole idea, we have to stick together. We can't just, we were founded by two nations trying to live side by side, two nations that had fought each other very, very, very brutally many times. So it was a real challenge, but we just met the challenge. We did it, and now my nieces and nephews are totally bilingual. I had sort of a more hopeless kind of French education, which was high school, and I can speak it a little bit, but not as much as I ought to be able to. But the kids, having grown up with it in kindergarten, then it's quite marvelous, and it's a good thing.
Thank you, Janelle Burke.
On a program like this, coming from North Idaho College, we must ask about education. And so what kind of education do Canadian children engage in, and how is it different or the same as the kinds of educational experiences that American children or U.S. children have?
Well, it's a great question because I've worked with education here in the States very passionately as a mother and a volunteer, and being in the classroom and thinking, are they going to learn geography and are they going to learn their history? And I did have this fear that I didn't want them not knowing about other people in other countries. And it's sort of perplexing to me because it would be taught in the classroom, but then out in the street asking a person a question, who are the allies to the United States in World War II? And only about 20% of the country can answer the question. So where does it get lost? That's what I've always wondered. But I do think that it is taught, and the education system in the United States is very good. It's obviously, it's wonderful. And I think ours is marvelous as well. I think one of the big differences is that in our universities, they're more affordable for every family because they are helped out by the federal government. Here, we're all in this competition, get into the best school, and can you afford it kind of thing, which I find a little nerve-wracking for the students. And I'm very proud to have a son at this college, and I think they're doing a great job here. So it just shows that you can get a good education in many different places. I myself went to, I think, 4 different colleges and had a good look at the differences, and I find them pretty similar, really, except for the cost.
Do children begin to go to school at about the same age?
Yes, and the elementary education, I think, is quite similar. In high school, history for me was much more in depth, much more of a world focus. When you think of the history of the United States, is not that many years, but it takes up a huge part of the curriculum, and it's often pulled out of context. And so I fear that the kids don't get a foundation from ancient times to the present. So.
And at what point do you graduate from secondary school?
We have an extra year of high school, grade 13. It was sheer torture at the time, but I think that I've needed a little bit more maturity. So, and we got to major, which was great for me because I was an English major.
In high school?
The last year of high school. So I got to do my topic in depth. And I think that when we went off to university, we really knew what we wanted to do by then. So we weren't spending that first year wandering around. So that part of it was great.
Thank you.
This is an issue that's really on the front burner, and that has to do with health care
Yes.
And so a lot of wonderful Americans along the border that live in Maine or New York or here in Idaho or Washington often go to Canada, and it's become a really major public policy issue in this country about the price of prescription drugs and all. Give us a little insight to the difference between the medical process in this country and Canada in relation to how medical services are run, particularly where the role of the government's involved.
That's a good question. My husband is a family physician, and I've been with him all through medical school and practicing here in North Idaho. And I'm also the niece of a physician in Canada. My uncle, Dr. Hugh Smythe, is head of the Arthritis Foundation and has had a long history there. So I feel that I've seen both sides, and I did see it switch over. And when it did switch over, I went to the same doctor, same doctor's office, same nurses, same everything, no bill. And so that was the only change that I saw. Now, over the years, of course, the cost has been a strain. And going down to visit a family member in an old hospital in Toronto, I would think, okay, this is starting to look not as nice as our hospital does here. But that has to do with funding and so on. I think the service is still great. Canadian doctors work very hard. And in terms of the safety net, it really has to do with what the citizens want. What is the most important to you? And as a country, we decided, let's take care of the very basics. Let's take care of our physical being, our children, our streets, our well-being, and start there. And so I think that has worked out very well.
On that note, I have to bring our program to conclusion. Elizabeth Brenton, it's been a great pleasure having you on the program, and you're a good example of why we wanted to do this series on celebrating Canadian American friendship, and we hope in the future that our people will appreciate and we'll even have more visits back and forth between the two countries. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Mr. Stewart. It's been wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, next week we're going to continue this series. It's a rather long series that we're doing on celebrating Canadian American friendship. And each year, you know, if you've been with us for some years, that we have a special series that we do tied to the symposium at North Idaho College, and we're in that series now. And I'd like to invite you again next week, and we'll have another exciting guest on this particular special topic. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.